This episode is supported by the AWS Insiders podcast. AWS Insiders is a fast-paced, entertaining, and insightful look behind the scenes of AWS and cloud computing. I'm a subscriber to AWS Insiders, and I love Rahul and Hillary's practical analysis and interviews. As an F1 racing fan, the recent episode on how AWS and F1 partnered together to make the races more exciting was especially entertaining. Search for AWS Insiders in your podcast player. We'll also include a link in the show notes. My thanks to AWS Insiders for their support.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Early, middle part of September 2023. Hope everybody's doing well. The weather's starting to get a little chillier, a little cooler. The wind's starting to pick up. The leaves are starting to change. Fall is in the air. Hope everybody's doing well. Another Sunday Perspective show. And today I want to talk a little bit about digital transformation. I want to talk a little bit about legal and liability and maybe how those two things are starting to, unfortunately, intersect way too much in what we used to consider just sort of the tech world. Lots of new technologies happening, interesting new tech, stuff that was, science fiction becomes real. And where I'm going with this is if we think about a bunch of the things that have been what we'll call digital transformation over the last, 5 or 6 years. So forget about the stuff that is sort of the behind the scenes, the sort of the DevOps and serverless and, WebAssembly and, kind of the Kubernetes and the containers of the world. But the actual, kind of digitally transforming economies, digitally transforming, big chunks of our economy, things that we've forever, taken for granted as being physical assets or so forth. So things from like ride sharing to monetary systems to now some of these things we're seeing with AI, we're starting to see a lot of gray areas form in terms of, questions about the legality of property ownership, the legality of, licensing and all those sort of things, and I think we're getting into an age in which so much of the foundational technologies are in place to do interesting stuff, to do digital transformation. But the things that are really, grabbing people's attention, again, whether it's, transforming, the ride sharing economy, but sort of everything around that, whether it's transforming digital currency or, a number of other things, we're starting to see early success. And then we're starting to quickly see sort of all sorts of sometimes very ugly, sometimes complicated litigation that's rolling around. And I thought we would be interesting to sort of dig into that intersection we're seeing, that sort of ongoing, constantly coming up intersection that we're seeing that we really haven't necessarily seen for the last, 15 or 20 years or even 30 years in terms of the evolution of technologies. We've seen technologies disrupt the economies, but we haven't necessarily seen people, looking at them as blatantly disrespecting or destroying laws and liability that was there in the past. So I want to dig into that after the break. Are you getting pressure from finance to justify or reduce your cloud bill? CloudZero is the only cloud cost platform loved by engineers and trusted by finance. CloudZero can identify unused, idle, or over-provisioned resources, alert you to spend anomalies, and organize 100% of your spend into a framework that mirrors your business structure, like cost per customer, product feature, or team. It's the most powerful platform ever built to provide accurate, granular visibility into your total cloud spend without the typical pitfalls of legacy cloud cost management tools like endless tagging or clunky Kubernetes support. Manage cost, optimize development, and maximize profit, all in one platform. Join companies like Rapid7, Drift, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started. That's cloudzero.com/cloudcast. Visit today to experience immediate and ongoing savings on your cloud bill. Today's sponsor is Datadog, a real-time monitoring platform that unifies metrics, logs, and distributed traces from your cloud containers and orchestration software. Datadog's container-centric monitoring features allow you to track the health and performance of your dynamic container environment. The container map provides a bird's eye view of your container fleet. And the Live Container View searches, groups, and filters your containers with any criteria, like tags, pods, or workspaces. To start monitoring your container clusters, sign up for a free trial today, and Datadog will send you a free t-shirt. Visit datadog.com/container-cloudcast to get started. That's datadog.com/container-cloudcast. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, kind of want to dive into this intersection we're seeing recently over the last, year and a half, 2 years, maybe a little bit 3 years, between sort of the things that we would talk about as examples of digital transformation, or big swaths of the economy, big kind of foundational things that interact with all sorts of our day-to-day live things, and some of the new liabilities and legal issues that are coming up around them. And it was one thing when you had stuff like you had the what do we call it? The sort of economy of that was Uber riders and people being able to just sort of do work and grab work based on somebody has a thing in their pocket, they have a phone. So basically the Airbnb, Uber sort of economy. And while those things were fantastically interesting, and obviously they highlighted the power of kind of digital technology. So a phone in somebody's pocket, being able to sort of monetize a physical asset, so a car or a hotel room or any other sort of sharing economy type of thing. And then what we would see is so much of that success or failure ended up getting wrapped up in this very, very direct interaction with bumping into not only sort of norms of society, but also legal aspects of society. So everything from whether or not it was legal for an Uber or a Lyft to operate as a ride-sharing service in a certain city, whether it was legal for Airbnb or Vrbo or any of those companies to be able to rent out parts of a hotel or parts of a room as if they were a hotel. Did they license to be essentially sort of a hotel? Did they need a license to be a cab driver, if you will? And so we saw this play out across lots and lots of cities and municipalities and city governments and national governments. We saw strikes in various cities and countries across Europe. We saw various cities and municipalities across the United States fight back against this, whether it was in Austin or San Francisco or New York or other places. And to me, that was kind of the first time that we really saw, and again, I consider myself somewhat of a decent technology historian. I'm probably missing some things, but it was kind of the first time that we really saw legal challenges, legal roadblocks come up when new technologies came along. And I say that in the context of we'd seen, many times in the past where a Netflix came along and sort of disrupted a Blockbuster, or we saw, again, sort of over the top internet services that were disrupting, whether it was retail, you could buy online, you could watch movies and stream music or video. I guess maybe the first one that we really saw would have gone back to the Napster days where we were, sharing music, quote unquote, sharing music, but also sort of stealing for copyrights and properties. And we've seen that, with people sort of stealing movies and so forth. So we've been through the sort of copyright protection piece of this. And again, that probably was a better example to use something like Napster, but, Uber being a little more timely. Napster was, more than a decade, almost 2 decades ago. And it sort of dawned on me again as we've been watching some of these newer technologies emerge around the new sort of liability or legal ramifications at the center of some of the newer technologies that we're dealing with, right? So in the past 3 months, 6 months, we've been watching everybody become an expert at open source licensing, open source legalities. We've seen lots of discussions about the morality of the right way to do open source versus the letter of the license. There's not really a law per se. I mean, there are licenses, hence there could be laws around open source, but we've seen a lot of hand waving and hand wringing about, the letter of the license versus the purpose or the kind of the spirit of the license, if you will. And we've seen that. And then the other thing that we're beginning to see more and more of, and I think we're going to see a lot of articles, probably a lot of sort of legal challenges written, is around what we're seeing with various types of AI, in particular generative AI, right? So at its beginning, if we look at something like an OpenAI, the models that they built, GPT-2, GPT-2, GPT-3, GPT-3.5, GPT-4, and so forth, those have all been fundamentally built using this concept that is fair use. The idea that if something is published, sort of freely published and open as far as information goes, it's not explicitly patented or copyrighted, it has the ability for fair use. People can use it to create derivative information from that information. So, for example, if this is just an example, like if you took all the statistics from a sports league, football or soccer or something like that, and then you created a business out of that, you don't necessarily have to, pay them for that money because those numbers are made sort of publicly available. Now, if you were reusing, trying to reuse the rights, kind of the video highlights from the game, those are protected, right? But fair use allows information that is publicly made, kind of made publicly available. It's intended for public use. It's covered under this concept of fair use doctrine, and people can kind of reuse it in interesting ways. And for the most part, that's kind of what's been going on with these huge sort of data collection things that are becoming the foundation of these gigantic models, right? Whether it's a Google model or an OpenAI model or Hugging Face or whoever it might be. And what we're starting to see is people putting two and two together, thinking 2 steps ahead, 10 steps ahead, 20 steps ahead, and starting to think about, what are the liabilities of these new things, this sort of new digital transformation that everybody's talking about. And it gets very interesting because it sort of builds off this idea that if the foundation of whatever gets built, a new service, a recommendation engine, an AI model, something that actually takes direct actions or whatever, if it was built off of, kind of openly, freely available information, is anybody liable for it if something new gets created, right? So that's one of the foundational questions. The next kind of questions become, if you build something derivative of that, how liable are you for information? Because we're going to run into these sort of weird situations and probably common situations in which, on one hand, we're going to talk about, things that have been created using stuff like generative AI as being these powerful additive tools, right? They could help developers code better. They could help operations people, build Ansible playbooks or Pulumi run books, or, we've seen, everybody in the operations space, from Honeycomb to Observe to others that are building these sort of add-on, generative AI things to help operations teams. And again, we've seen these sort of co-pilots for helping developers code. So those are, just a couple of examples of things that are really relevant to us in the tech company. Obviously, we've seen lots of ideas floating around in terms of, how can these help lawyers? How can these help teachers? How can these help marketing teams and lots of other types of roles? But then we've also seen, and people have gotten excited about that. They've thought about, boy, how can this make somebody that's a 3 out of 10 skill set become a 10 out of 10? How can this, make everybody in your team a superstar? How can you potentially do twice as much work with the same number of people, and all sorts of permutations about that? But we've also all started learning about the realities of it, which is, these new technologies built off of lots of different data sets. They're trying to learn how to be smart, if you will. In many cases, they produce great information. In other cases, they produce what we call hallucinations, which is the perception of great information, formatted as great information, but, some percentage inaccurate or large percentage of it inaccurate, right? And so, we start to get into these questions of like, how much are we talking about that is just errors, mistakes and errors and so forth, and how much of it is things that we need to think about in terms of liabilities, right? So we start to think about, if you create a derivative, you create a derivative of an AI model. So you're working on, Hugging Face model, and you're going to build something that is going to be specific for an industry or use case. And maybe you build it pretty good. Maybe it gives a recommendation to somebody. What are you going to have to do from a liability and a legal perspective to ensure that if a customer, a user takes that as a suggestion, that you don't get sued, that you don't create a liability? What happens if, it's one thing if you give a recommendation for, you're creating a technology, an operational playbook, to go automate some task or something, or configure some firewall. It's one thing to be like, well, it's mostly correct. It could have some errors. You should make sure that your people are certified to know, how to look through that and look for errors. But what happens when that thing, does a configuration? You push it out because you're working the night shift at 2 a.m. You just assume the system works. You push it out to 1,000 devices, and all of a sudden you've basically locked down the store. You've locked your users out of being able to interact with your e-commerce site for an hour, 6 hours, 12 hours, 20 hours. Who's liable for that? What types of liabilities will that create in terms of, is that just an error? Is it a bug? Is it a user error? Is it, does the system make any sort of guarantees of the quality of what they do? And then you can take this a little bit further and start to think about, well, let's say we're doing something that literally is more life and death, right? It's a system that is augmenting doctors. It could be doing a telehealth type of thing, a teledoc system. It could be, augmenting, telling you which medications to take as a result of putting a bunch of symptoms into a website that says, hey, I'm not feeling this good. So sort of something that that augments a WebMD, if you will, or that type of system. Now what are we getting into, right? Again, how much accuracy do we expect from our digitally transformative types of things versus how much kind of warning can we give to our users in terms of, well, this should be mostly right, directionally right, generally helpful, or, how do we go about measuring that? And I think what we're going to run into, and I think we're going to begin to see, and God, I hate that I'm even thinking about this, but I think we're going to start seeing people talk about legal ops or liability ops, the same way that we're talking about FinOps, right? Or financial cloud cost management. We're going to be talking about, what is your legal ops team doing working with your application developers? What's your liability ops team doing working with your data scientists, right? Are you going to have to start getting your legal ops team involved with your marketing team making claims about, what they're putting in ad copy? Are people going to misread that? Because we've already seen stuff like that, right? Like people will look at a box of mac and cheese or cereal and look at it and go, I was expecting this exact same thing on the box, and what I got was different, and they create lawsuits about doing that. And that's about stuff that people were probably behind, taking the picture of what the cereal box looked like, or, people were explicitly behind building the copy for that. And so it's going to be interesting. We've always had instances in which legal teams had to be involved with some aspect of what you're doing technology, right? If you're in financial services or healthcare or any number of industries, you're familiar with working with auditors, regulators. And, we've had, FISMA and PCI and HIPAA and all sorts of, interactions of technology with this. But this is where we're going to start stepping into the stuff we talk about with digital transformation, right? The things that directly interact with our users, not so much how do we maintain the data, how do we manage credit card numbers or, personal information, PII, but, how we're making recommendations to people, right? How are we, augmenting the things that we do? And so I think it's going to, bring us to a point where we really have to think about a number of questions, right? What are companies going to be liable for, right? Where does the liability potentially begin? Does it begin with going all the way back to the source of data that are building these models? Does it begin only when you've created something that you would sort of claim is your derivative? So an AI model, is it an AI recommendation from an AI model? Is it an AI action? Like, oh, hey, system, what do you think I should do? It spits something back. And then maybe you turned on by default, hey, whatever it spits back to me, go take that action, right? Where does that potential liability come into play? And more importantly, like, what's the definition of liability going to be, right? How do we measure, how do we communicate that, some new aspect of this digital transformation that we're trying to do could be slightly wrong, could be slightly off. And that's a feature of the system, not a bug of the system, right? There was an interesting interview with with Adam Selipsky. We talked about it a few weeks ago on the podcast, and I talked about what will AWS look like after it crosses the chasm, right? And the whole idea was sort of based on this interview that happened recently, in which Adam Selipsky sat down with, I think it was The Verge, but I may have that wrong, and he essentially asked him a whole bunch about the AWS business, but then he really kind of got into, you are going to host other people running on your platform. What liability do you have in being that hosting provider? And Adam, for the most part, I think knew that was a question that wasn't going to have a simple answer. It was going to be complicated, and it wasn't something that, he probably was completely prepared to give any sort of answer that wasn't, shouldn't have had a lawyer present in the room, right? Not that he was going to be getting himself into trouble, but he didn't want to communicate something that was, pretty complicated, probably had never really been, tested out or vetted in that specific situation in a courtroom. And in general, you don't ever want to, try and answer a hypothetical about a legal situation, because, again, everything in every legal situation is somewhat unique to, where you're located and the jurisdiction, the laws specifically being addressed, and all sorts of stuff, precedent and other stuff. But it did bring up an interesting sort of question that I think we're going to have to think about as an industry is, where will liability reside in these sort of new emerging digital transformations? Will they reside in the source of data? Will they reside in the people that are hosting the data or hosting the services that are, ultimately driving this, right? i.e. the cloud providers? Will it reside with application developers? So, that application developer or that application development team that built a product, built an application service, they could be an open source group, it could be a project, something like a Hugging Face, not trying to use them specifically, but something that's like that. Would it be a systems integrator that, took a number of elements, data plus open source elements or, proprietary elements, put together, the systems integrator, would they be liable for this? Would the actual end customer who has a direct sort of financial one-to-one relationship with an end user be responsible? Where's that liability? And I wonder if we're going to start getting into, these situations in which, the way that we think about legality, liability, risk, for things that, inherently may or may not be accurate, may or may not be measurable to their accuracy, is going to be really, really interesting. And I think we're going to have to we're going to go through the phase in which we are very excited about these technologies. We're going to go through the normal phase of what if, what's possible, what big picture could we create that would change the world. And we're going to hear from lots of people that are going to help change the world. And, we're going to figure out if these new digital transforming technologies are effective, right? Do they do something that's interesting, that's valuable, that's generating new revenue, generating new differentiation, reducing costs, whatever it might be doing. And then we will go through the normal trough of disillusionment, which will be people will start to figure out, do new laws apply to this stuff? Do new legalities and concerns and risks apply to this stuff? Or maybe it doesn't, right? Maybe there will be some, precedent case that will, declare that, hey, derivative works of hallucinations, I'll get the word right at some point, can't be held liable. I don't know. But I think until those things come out, we're going to be sort of living in this interesting world in which we are fascinated with the possibilities of what these things could be. And it will be interesting to see how loud or how strong the counterbalancing voice in the room will be to say, hey, it's awesome that we're doing this, but what if? But what if this happens to a customer? What happens, what if downstream from a customer, this happens or this happens, how far do those ripples have to extend that we're potentially liable for? All right. And what impact do those conversations have in making the technology better, right? Kind of steering it to have a focus. How much does that slow things down, right? So the same way that we've talked for years and years that, security is the Department of No, oftentimes, right? They slow things down because, doing security is very, very difficult. And, building applications is all about agility, right? That sort of DevSecOps trade-off. Are we going to start seeing, the legal and liability groups be a part of this, right? How quickly will we see legal and liability groups get up to speed about this stuff, right? So the same way that we've seen, FinOps kind of go through the accounting department and the IT department don't speak the same language. I think we're going to see the same sort of thing. So I think it'll be interesting to sort of watch where this goes. This isn't entirely about AI. I know I've mentioned in previous shows we're trying not to make every single show be about this, but it's such a pervasive technology wave right now. We're seeing every company talk about it. We're seeing so many projects that I think we also need to be conscious of thinking about the first order, second order, third order effects that we need to be somewhat aware of. And as a technology industry, we are, forever in love with the idea of the person that's changing the rules. And once somebody tells you they're changing the rules, they're changing the world, we sort of have this tendency to kind of give them the benefit of the doubt, even though maybe in the back of our mind, we know that, well, that change isn't going to come easily. It's not going to come inexpensively. It's not going to come without breaking a lot of glass, breaking some eggs, all those sort of, bad analogies. But I do think it's worth us starting to have the conversation of where do we think these issues of legality, liability, how do we put guardrails around it? How do we prevent it? How do we protect ourselves? How do we protect our users? How do we protect our companies? Needs to be at least be part of the conversation, needs to be in the room, needs to be on the agenda. Whether or not it'll bubble up to the top usually, depends on a lawsuit or a legal issue or some terrible catastrophic failure happening. But I'd love to hear people's feedback on what they're thinking about this, if they're starting to explore the space, if they're doing work within the space. I'd love to hear from anybody in the legal community that is actively working on this. I obviously am not a lawyer, don't take anything from this show as any sort of legal advice or legal guidance. Just looking at this from the perspective of, somebody who tries to think a little bit bigger picture, tries to think about both, the technology, the economics of it, and now the legalities of it. And it feels like, we've seen enough, at least a few interesting instances, again, whether it was the sharing economy, whether it was crypto, now with some of the AI stuff, that, legal has to be part of that discussion early on. Otherwise, we're gonna have some catastrophic failures like we did in some of these other previous generations of digital transformation. So anyways, that Sunday Perspective, thank you all for listening. Again, not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. Please don't take it as legal advice. Just somebody thinking about, trying to, where do we put those frameworks, those guardrails, those protections in place so that none of you get in too much trouble. None of you burn something down you're not supposed to burn down. So anyways, with that, thank you all for listening. You all are awesome. Thanks for, tuning on every week, giving us feedback. Really, really appreciate it. We have, Aaron told me the other day that we are now booked out all the way through November in terms of guests. So really excited about a lot of the things that we've got coming for you here as we get into the fall and into the winter. November is going to be into the winter time. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow the show. Thanks for giving us rankings and reviews and 5-star ratings on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Google and all the places to get your podcasts. So with that, I'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.